Welcome, everyone, to this explainer on Kentucky, the myth of the empty wilderness. Today, we are going to completely reframe the foundational history of this state. We're going to smash that old, tired narrative of an untouched frontier and instead uncover a complex, dynamic, and deeply human story.
Okay, let's dive into this with a quote you might actually recognize. Back in the 1890s, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner introduced his very famous but ultimately flawed frontier thesis. He defined the frontier as the meeting point between savagery and civilization. Turner basically argued that the American character was forged by Europeans stepping out into this free, empty land. But here's the problem. By equating civilization strictly with European boundaries, he literally erased thousands of years of Native American history. He reduced thriving, complex societies to a vacant wilderness that was supposedly just sitting there waiting to be claimed.
So that begs the question, was Kentucky ever truly an empty wilderness? Early colonists pushed this myth of the dark and bloody drowned. They wanted people to think Native Americans only used the area as some violent, uninhabited battleground. Honestly, it was a really convenient excuse to just take the land. But when we actually look at the historical record, it reveals a completely different reality. Kentucky was deeply inhabited, actively managed, and a hotly contested homeland.
To put that into perspective, take a look at this timeline. We're talking about a human presence stretching back over 12,000 years. But the key takeaway for us isn't just memorizing these dates. It's understanding that from the early Paleo-Americans all the way to the archaic culture, these folks were not just passive wanderers, they were actually environmental engineers. Thousands of years before European contact, native societies were deliberately burning underbrush to create massive meadows. They were literally engineering the environment to draw in herds of bison and elk. So those natural hunting grounds the pioneers later marveled at? Yeah, those were actually the result of millennia of careful, intentional ecological management.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive leap in societal complexity over those millennia. On one hand, we have a Clovis point. It's a highly effective but relatively simple nomadic hunting tool. Now, contrast that with the cross-cut profile of the Adena-era Robbins Mound. Constructing complex earthworks and massive burial tombs like this, that requires stable agriculture. It requires specialized labor and organized leadership. It absolutely proves we're looking at a highly complex civilization with incredibly deep roots.
Fast forward to about 1750, and Kentucky was what historians call a heavily utilized middle ground. It was this shared, intensely contested space claimed by powerful indigenous nations, groups like the Shawnee, Cherokee, and Chickasaw. And they possessed these extensive, sophisticated diplomatic and trade networks that stretched all the way across the continent. So, when colonists finally crested the Appalachian Mountains, they weren't stepping into some pristine void. They were wandering right into a highly complex international geopolitical web.
To truly grasp the clash of these two very different worlds, we have to analyze their social structures, and specifically, let's look at gender roles. British colonial women like the famous captive Mary Draper Ingalls lived under really strict patriarchal rules. They were confined to the domestic realm, completely excluded from leadership. Contrast that with native cultures, which often featured matrilineal blending. You had Shawnee women like Nonalema, who served as highly influential peace and war chiefs. They directed agriculture, and they commanded real respect and diplomacy. Historically speaking, it makes total sense why many captive white women actually chose to stay with native communities. They were offered a level of autonomy that was just completely foreign to colonial European society.
But unfortunately, this delicate middle ground was destined to collapse under the crushing weight of global capitalism. The massive European demand for animal skins fundamentally altered native economies. Suddenly, native men were pressured to hunt year-round just for profit. And then came the colonial long hunters, guys like Daniel Boone. The result of this clash was just devastating waste. We're talking about fields of rotting bison carcasses, stripped of their skins and left to decay. This completely enraged native populations, violently destabilizing the shared, sustainable hunting practices that had kept the region thriving for centuries.
So the crucial point is this high-level historical shift from extractive colonialism to settler colonialism. Initially, the British and French practiced extractive colonialism, right? They were just taking furs and raw materials without permanently settling down. But by the 1770s, this morphs into settler colonialism. And this is a radically different beast. It was driven by a desire for the land itself. Wealthy land companies formed with the explicit on-the-record goal of surveying and permanently stealing the territory, which fundamentally meant displacing the native populations who lived there.
This brings us to the invasion of Kentucky. This shift from just extracting resources to permanent settlement triggered an outright invasion. It forced native nations into a desperate, all-out fight for the very survival of their homeland against this relentless, unending tide of colonial surveyors and militias.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is just the utter chaos of this settler invasion. Look at Jefferson County in 1798. You have this absolute mess of overlapping or shingled property lines. It was a bureaucratic free-for-all that led to literally decades of fierce legal battles among the settlers themselves. But if you look beneath all those messy ink lines drawn by colonizers, what you're really seeing is a massive legalized erasure. Ancient, sophisticated, and sovereign native lands were being legally and literally wiped off the map.
Which brings us to our final, defining question for this explainer. If we accept that the frontier wasn't an empty wilderness, but actually a fiercely defended homeland, how does the invasion of Kentucky change the story of America? Well, it forces us to confront the real impact of global capitalist pressures and the purposeful erasure of native sovereignty. Understanding this higher-level dynamic fundamentally rewrites our entire understanding of how the United States was truly built. I want you to think critically about that as we continue our journey through history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.